Matt Lewis.
Matt Lewis.
Matt Lewis.
Matt Lewis.
Matt Lewis with the Daily Beast. He's their senior columnist.
Friend of mine and friend of America.
All right, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. Thank you, everybody who supports us on Patreon. It's patreon.com/Matt Lewis. Thank you for rating and reviewing this podcast as well. We have another great guest today. His name is Shadi Hamid. He's a senior fellow at Brookings, a contributing writer at The Atlantic, and he's the co-host of the Wisdom of Crowds podcast, also the author of a great book called Islamic Exceptionalism. Shadi Hamid, welcome back to the news.
Hi, Matt. Thanks for having me.
Great to talk with you again. I've been loving your tweets over at Shadi Hamid on Twitter, and you've been staking out this really, I think, important and interesting territory. There are a lot of people critiquing the illiberalism on the right. You have been pointing out illiberalism on the left. I think this is a big problem, possibly one that is going to be a mounting problem. What is it about this trend that caused you to start writing and tweeting about it?
Well, I mean, first of all, when people ask me like, Shadi, why don't you say more about Trump's illiberalism or folks on the right who are saying really problematic things, that's more of a threat. I say, yeah, I agree with you that it's a threat. But my instinct is always to think about what isn't being said. So when I think about colleagues and peers and folks who I follow on Twitter, most of us agree that Trump is a really bad president. Most of us are really uncomfortable with various trends in right-wing populism. So if that's already established, I feel like you're not really doing much of a service if you just repeat the obvious. Where I do think there's a lack of agreement and a lack of consensus is in the problematic developments on my own side. And I think if we all as Americans focused more on our own side, we'd all be better off. And so I try to say, well, hey, we should be engaging in some self-criticism. I consider myself to be of the left. I'm obviously more on the heterodox side of things, so I confuse people. And I don't think conservatives are evil, so people are sometimes confused by that. But yeah, I want to look inwards and say, hey, we're getting certain things wrong. There's some very problematic developments in discourse where there's a sort of, what we're all talking about, the hyper woke discourse, where if you say certain things that aren't in line with this approach, you're seen as problematic. You're seen as betraying the left. You're seen maybe even as racist or sympathetic to racist ideas. And what that means in practice is that we can't have open debate because everyone's afraid of what they're saying or not saying. And we see this on Twitter where people, you can tell people are suppressing what they're saying, especially if you don't have a secure position. Let's say you're an aspiring journalist or grad student and you don't want to alienate your future employers, or let's say you want to get a job at the New York Times in a year or two, you're going to be a little bit more careful about what you say. And that to me is really scary, where we're getting to a position where open, healthy debate in good faith is not going to be possible on the left side of the spectrum.
Yeah. I also think, Shadi, that it's radicalizing people to make them more right-wing. I mean, look, I have to tell you that, and first of all, I agree about the part about critiquing your own side. I wrote my book, Too Dumb to Fail. I'm a conservative, and that was critiquing the dumbing down of conservatism and the nationalism and the populism and all the things that concern me on the right. And so I applaud you for what you're doing. But I can tell you, as someone who is I'm a center-right person, but I'm also, I read the New York Times. I like the New York Times. I like the Washington Post and things. But increasingly, I am seeing things at places like the New York Times that really upset me. And if I didn't have to, for professional reasons, if I didn't have to read it, I think I would just check out and just say, like, they don't want me here. It's not just the Trump people they don't want. They don't want me either. And I think that's a really dangerous place to be when you're alienating people. And where are they going to go? That's the other question. If they're not reading the New York Times, where are they going to go? So I commend you for taking up this cause.
Well, thanks. It shouldn't be too much to ask from people to engage with folks who have disagreements with them and not condemn them as being evil or bad. And like you're saying, you would be considered with some of your more socially conservative views, let's say, you'd be considered to be a bad person, that you would be seen as morally deficient, even though you're anti-Trump, and even though you always engage in good faith on Twitter. Like, you're not someone who's out there to catch people and all that. But and so that's where I think if folks on the left see 45% of the American population as being irredeemable. So let's say anyone who supports Trump plus even anti-Trump conservatives are a big chunk of this country, close to a half of the country. And now those people are seen as too problematic, if you will. And this is where I think the woke discourse, it's like religion without religion. It's taking religious ways of looking at life, in the sense of having concepts of sin, atonement, original sin, let's say, when it comes to, issues around the founding, where so everything has a kind of moral component to it, and everything has this almost theological intensity. And I'm fine with religion and theological intensity if you are praying to a God, a real God, or a true God, or if from a monotheistic standpoint, let's say, I think there's a certain respect Christians and Jews and Muslims have for each other, even though they might not agree theologically, is that, hey, we believe in a God and we can respect that at least. Now, in this situation, we have people who are in effect praying to a false God, this kind of sort of secular idea of progress, which sometimes I'm okay with, but it's not an ultimate source of truth. So when you're taking a religious approach and you're applying it to a secular space, that's where I really start to get nervous. I mean, if you want to do religion, do religion. If you want to do politics, do politics. But politics, everyday politics, should not be theological, because what that means is that everything is existential. And I don't think we can live together as Americans if every policy or political disagreement is basically an existential theological one. And also, I think and we can talk about this more, there's also a question, as you said, of pushing people to the right or pushing people towards Donald Trump. So even if you believe in this woke stuff, there should also be a realization that it puts a lot of people off, and we want to win an election. And I'm not reticent to say that I really don't want Trump to win in November, because honestly, I can't deal with 4 more years of this. The country can't deal with 4 more years of this. And it's a scary thought that we're going to have to replicate the last 4 years, but maybe in a more intense, chaotic way for an additional, and this is where we have to think seriously about, there's a real risk of Joe Biden losing. We were overconfident a month or 2 ago. There's more and more signs that this is going to be a close election. So let's think strategically about what the message is, and let's not try to put people off and push them in the hands of Donald Trump.
Yeah, man, so much to say and to digest there. First, I think you're totally spot on about the critique now is, it's not just, well, Matt Lewis is wrong. It's like, he's immoral. I get accused all the time, amazingly, all the time, of trying to be for Trump, or because I'm not voting for Joe Biden, that's just the same as voting for Trump. It's the same thing in their minds. And that's immoral. And if this is a religion, then we don't just disagree, but you're a heretic if you are for the wrong person, or actually if you're just not even for, it's not even enough to be for the wrong person. It's if you're just not 100% on board with our doctrine, then you're a heretic. And I do have to say, I am so again, I've been criticizing Trump for years. I've probably written more anti-Trump columns than anybody in America. I would stack it up against almost anybody. But even I have to say, there are moments when, whether it's NPR doing a story about looting is fine, or the whole issue of cancel culture and the Harper's magazine thing. I mean, there are moments where even I am like, maybe I should vote for Trump. Yeah. And then of course, 5 minutes later, Trump says or does something insane, and it never lasts, and it's not going to last. Don't worry. But my point is, like, if even I am in danger of being pushed into his arms, into this tribalistic, sort of world, then imagine the average person. It's scary.
Yes, that's really interesting. You mentioned that even, like, as you said, you are pretty clearly anti-Trump, and your credentials are really strong on that. And it even worries me hearing you describe this process where sometimes you're like, it's a binary choice. And if you see the other side, Andrew Sullivan was attacked a lot for making a similar point, and people, I think, twisted what he was trying to say, that if basic security and order are important to you, that you don't want to see rioting on the street, that you don't want to see political violence, that you don't want to see anarchists destroying property, that's a pretty important and fundamental issue in any functioning democracy. And if that becomes the dividing line, then there's a real risk that people will say, well, we hate Trump, but the other side is empowering or looking the other way while people destroy communities and whatever else is going on. So that's what I think is, it's understandable that people would start to wonder. I don't personally think that if Biden wins, these folks will be empowered. And in some sense, I'm happy that Biden is the candidate, because he's kind of unwoke. And I think that he instinctually sees any of this kind of anarchic left-wing violence as something very problematic. But I can understand when I have conservative friends who say, Shadi, fine, Biden isn't part of this scene. However, is he going to be strong enough to really rein these people in? And we're worried about it. And I think that's a legitimate concern, and we shouldn't just dismiss it out of hand. And also, from what I recall, Matt, you were, and I remember tweeting about this at the time, and around 2016, before the election, and then after the election, you were warning, you saw the rise of Trump before most people. And some of your tweets and articles were so prescient in this respect. So if you're starting to worry that we might see a repeat of Trump winning, you have you've been right about this before. I don't want to test the proposition, but the fact that smart folks who saw the rise of Trump before almost anyone else in 2015 and 2016 are getting more and more worried about the outcome in November, that should tell us something.
Yeah, I do have to say, I think Joe Biden's speech in Pittsburgh yesterday, we're taping this on Tuesday, so on Monday, was a very, very, very good and reassuring speech. And I felt like, and I got mocked a little bit on Twitter for saying this by the cool kids on Twitter, but I felt like Biden was nearing what was potentially like an inflection point where this narrative could get away from him, and where, if you are a patriotic, God-fearing American who doesn't like violence and looting and rioting, you would be forced to vote for Trump. I felt like that narrative was emerging, and that Biden, not that you could say he's a radical, but that he, didn't, I would say, forcefully enough condemn the rioting. You could sort of get away with that. I think Biden really helped himself out with that speech. It's just one speech. He's going to have to keep this up for 60 more days, but I thought it was a big step forward. What did you think of that?
Yeah, I thought so too. And I was really happy to see that. I was even just happy to see that finally they're taking the initiative and trying to be more proactive, because there was a sense that Biden was on the right side of this and you could tell that he was uncomfortable with these developments. But it's like, where is he in terms of playing a leadership role and trying to make the case in a more affirmative, proactive way? So it's good to see that first step being taken. I wonder sometimes about how effective it has to be built on. This has to be the starting point of a broader message, and I hope that Joe Biden stays engaged. And if we see a continuation of certain kinds of rioting or property damage or whatever else it might be, that Biden is continuously trying, and not just making statements or giving speeches, but also trying to mobilize the party infrastructure, including on a local level, and talking to mayors who are trying to deal with this and who maybe haven't had as consistent or clear an approach condemning violence, or at least even saying that, hey, there has to be a police presence, certain buildings have to be protected, we shouldn't let mobs take control of city blocks in places like Portland or whatever else it might be. That Biden has to get on the phone and actually try to use his position as the candidate of the party to actually see change on the ground. And that's where I think speeches, maybe they lay the intellectual framework for this more practical response, but we actually have to see Biden engaging on this with other party officials and local leaders.
Yeah, I think that elections are. I like to say, it's not original to me, but the quote, "Logic leads to conclusions, but emotion leads to action." And I think emotion is so powerful, and Donald Trump realizes this. And right now we're so polarized, we're so tribalistic, but the emotions of fear and racial anxiety, I think Trump obviously is trying to stoke them, and it's horrific. But I think the other thing is, in a way, a lot of woke Twitter and progressives, I think, are helping him. I mean, Shadi, I have to tell you, if you're a white
Yeah.
person, if you're a white person, um, you were kind of told that you're not cool. You really shouldn't be weighing in on any issue because you're privileged. And look, first of all, I think it's wrong to to make fun of people or diminish them based on any immutable characteristic, and that includes white people. But secondly, I just think it's really dangerous politics, because Joe Biden is going to need, and by the way, I think Joe Biden was nominated because he can appeal both to some working class white Americans and some suburban white Americans who frankly don't like Donald Trump's style. They don't like Donald Trump's rhetoric. They don't like his tweets. And it's almost like some of the woke Twitter folks are trying to alienate white people, going out of their way, which I think plays into Trump's hands. You're a person of color who is sounding the alarm on this, and in a way, I feel like you are in a better position than I am to talk about it.
Yeah, well, so I'll just be straight up about this. I think it's just worth saying, so I do have a certain level of protection in these debates. I'm Muslim, I'm Arab, I'm brown, person of color, whatever, all these things. And my Muslim and Arab identity is important to me, and I write a lot about issues dealing with Muslim communities and the role of Islam in public life. So that's always been clear in the way that I approach these issues, and that helps a little bit. And sometimes when my white friends will send me furtive DMs saying, "Shadi, I'm really liking your tweets on this stuff, pushing back against some of this woke narrative," and they're like, "We can't," and they're like, in these DMs privately, they're like, "We can't really say this because of our job situation," but let's be honest. And I tell some of my friends this: listen, man, I would not be saying this if I was white. So,
Yeah. But isn't that? I mean, I think it's funny and it's true, but isn't it also like a commentary on how bad things are? Like, you shouldn't look. I don't think people should be jerks. I think sometimes things that are called political correctness are really just being polite. But we shouldn't. It shouldn't be the case that only people who have a certain identity are allowed to talk about certain issues, right?
Exactly, and we're joking about it. It is really problematic, and my position is basically that no one should feel that they can or can't say anything really based on immutable characteristics. So the fact of someone being white, which as far as I can tell is an accident of birth, that should never prevent them from speaking out on things that they believe to be true. Obviously, again, they're we're talking about folks who are willing to engage in good faith. Obviously, there do exist white supremacists and avowed racists, but the vast majority of Americans, in my view, and even white Americans, are not that, and they shouldn't feel like they can't talk about issues that are relevant to them. So when people say you can only talk about your own experience, all of, all of these debates affect every single American. If we're basically trying to criminalize whiteness and we're telling white people that there's something inherent about them that makes them bad, or that they can't transcend the original sin of the founding, and this will always be with them, and their job as white people is to basically beg for forgiveness. And I'm sort of caricaturing the position a little bit, but not by that much. I mean, if you actually read what people like Robin DiAngelo write in the book White Fragility, it is this idea that being white is always something you have to be conscious of, and you always have to be basically apologizing to people of color. So that does affect white people. So it's totally understandable that, white folks in America would say, hey, you know, uh, I get that I have to defer sometimes when it comes to what people of color experience, but when you're actually talking about their own whiteness, they should have something to say about that, because they're the ones who are being affected if they're being demonized constantly for who they are based on immutable characteristics. So I think that it gets to a bigger issue that there are more and more people on the left who see immutable characteristics as the defining issue and the major explanatory variable that explains everything. So you'll hear sometimes people talking about how it's all about white supremacy. White supremacy is the one thing that explains anything from housing policy to educational issues to the decline of two-parent households in urban communities. And yes, white supremacy and the legacy of slavery is one factor that still. So I'm someone who does believe that systemic racism or structural racism is real. We can debate about what that actually means from a definitional standpoint, but I think there are legacies that are very difficult to undo. And we see that in some aspects of housing policy, like redlining and so on. But that shouldn't be the all encompassing explanation. Class matters, poverty matters, and class and poverty aren't always about race.
Right.
They disproportionately affect people of color and Black communities in particular. But and this is where I was open about this during the campaign. I mean, I was supporting, as odd as it might sound to some of your listeners, I was supporting Bernie Sanders for complex reasons that we don't have to go into. But one of the reasons was because I do think class and economic inequality and poverty are destabilizing for our country. That we have massive inequalities now, and if we don't find a way to address them systematically, we're going to have a greater risk of instability, of unrest, of disillusion in the democratic system itself. If our system can't address these inequalities in a serious way, I do worry about what that means for faith in the idea of democracy. So that's one of the things that appealed to me about Bernie Sanders, but also, and people tend to maybe or forget about this now, Bernie is pretty unwoke. And that's why Bernie doesn't really fit into this moment, and he hasn't been very vocal, and he hasn't been going viral, because I don't think Bernie sees things fundamentally in terms of skin color and race. And I think that's actually a kind of good old-fashioned thing about Bernie. He actually takes class seriously. And that's anathema now to these new activists where everything is about whiteness or blackness or about your identity or immutable characteristics. Anyway, yeah, there's...
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, I think that, we live in a complex world, and these isms are really reductionist and simplistic. And I mean, I think, materialism is a part of our story, but it's not the only story. And I think identity and systemic racism are a part of our story, but it's not all of our story. And they want to boil it down and reduce it to one thing. I think it's just wrong. I think it's harmful. And I think it's actually boring as well. I mean, and that's one of the problems I'm having right now. I got involved in journalism and commentary because I like talking about ideas, and but if everything is predicated on, you're going to vote a certain way because of your status or your identity, then ideas don't really matter, right? And then I think the other point that you made earlier, which is to say that this has become a religion, and so if you're either orthodox or you're a heretic. That really kind of takes the fun out of debating politics. It's hard to go have a beer after, debating somebody if you believe that they're frankly immoral. And so that's part of why we've gotten in this very toxic situation where people are not getting along.
Yeah, exactly. How do we engage in debate if you're assumed to be evil from the get-go, or maybe not evil, or maybe that's pushing it, but if you're seen as a threat? So this is the problem too, that woke people on Twitter will sometimes say things to me and others like, well, what you're saying is a threat to my very being. Your words are effectively violence. This new idea that words aren't just words, that they actually threaten people in a physical sense. First of all, yeah,
Shadi, it's not only words. Now silence.
Oh,
is
yes.
violence.
Good point.
Silence is also violence.
The lack of words. Words and the lack of words are a threat to people. So I mean that's crazy to me. But I think your broader point that some of these debates are boring, I'd go even a step further, and I'd say at some basic level, woke discourse is ridiculous. And so as an example, my mom has been asking me about wokeness. She doesn't understand it. It's a new concept to her. So we've been engaged in this dialogue the past couple months where she wants me to help her understand what some of this new discourse is about. My parents are immigrants. They're born and raised in Egypt. My dad came in the 70s. My mom came in 1980. So for them, I think that certain political trends in America that are very much based on race and skin color don't really come naturally to them. That's not how they see the world. So I'm trying to explain. I remember there have been a couple of moments where I'm trying to lay out as generously as I can. I'm not trying to caricature this stuff. I'm trying to say, well, this is what they actually say. And when I'm explaining it, even in a kind of nice, gentle way, I'm like, this is ridiculous. What I'm telling my mom, and my mom is just looking at me with a blank stare, and she's like, what are you talking about? You talk to anyone who's not privy to this discourse and try to explain it to them, it really sounds bizarre. It sounds like a cult. And that's why I think non-Americans, wokeness is spreading, and this is where American soft power in terms of our influence in the rest of the world can be problematic, that we're actually exporting some of these really bad ideas, and you're starting to see more signs of it in places like, Britain, France, and so on. And it's not natural to their own, let's say, local discourse. And that's why when I talk to my, foreigner friends, a lot of them just don't understand what's happening in America. They're like, what is this? What are these weird debates that you guys are having about like whiteness and everything? It just doesn't, it's bizarre.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, I'm sure you saw it, Shadi. Part of what is driving this is Twitter and videos. And I mean, there was a video. The videos are probably what upset me the most and make me the most want to go vote for Trump. Which is a silly thing, and I won't do it. But it's an urge. But you probably saw that video. There was like a woman who was dining at a restaurant, and these white woke protesters came in and were surrounding her, shouting "Silence is violence" and things like that, and really trying to intimidate her and coerce her into, raising her fist in solidarity. And it's just, it's a scary thing. It's an insulting, offensive thing to be forced to make a political statement against your will. And I feel like if you're either the victim of this or just a bystander or someone just watching it on Twitter, there's like really two ways you can go. Okay. One option is like to try to appease them, to do what they say. But it seems like it used to be if you were liberal enough or progressive enough, you could buy indulgences from the mob, and they would like let you off. You could wear your hair with cornrows and not be accused of social or cultural appropriation, and you could be cool because you had the right political views. I don't think that's an option anymore. And so what happens is you can either try to appease them, which probably won't work, or you can resist it. And I think that is helping fuel some of the white supremacy and the right wing like populism and nationalism that we're seeing. So this is like it's such a vicious cycle that I think is creating extremists on both sides.
Yeah, and this is why, I think now is the time to resist. There shouldn't be appeasement. Those of us who are on the left who disagree with this way of doing politics, we should say so clearly and not indulge. So like if I was sitting at that restaurant and I saw that video and I was shocked because I live in DC, I go to outdoor restaurants in the COVID era, and I can't imagine that if I'm trying to enjoy a meal with friends, you have people coming up and wanting me to like declare allegiance to a movement while I'm eating. It's just like it's nuts.
I would be pissed. I would be pissed if like Citizens for Ronald Reagan came up.
Yeah, anyone really
started forcing me to like salute the Gipper.
Yes, but of course that doesn't happen because folks on the right wouldn't do that. It doesn't come naturally to them to kind of accost people, I guess, at least in DC. But I think that it's worth reminding people though, and this is where I think I worry sometimes that these isolated incidents are used to delegitimize the Democratic Party at large. And that's what Trump was trying to do in the Republican National Convention, to say that this is today's Democratic Party. So I think it's worth emphasizing that those people who are accosting folks at restaurants, they're a small minority. And I think it's important to say they're a problem, but they don't represent the majority of the Democratic Party. And if there's a silent majority of the Democratic Party, I think that they have to be less silent and say, we don't want to have this in our party. You don't represent us. And you're actually undermining Joe Biden's chances of winning. But part of the problem is that, and this is where I am sympathetic to what some of my conservative friends say sometimes, which is that even if they're not going to vote for Trump, they're still very worried about a Biden victory because the left is already dominant culturally. The left dominates in mainstream cultural and political institutions. So whether it's universities or the New York Times or the Post or whatever, liberals and Democrats are predominant. We all know that, right? And I think there's now a worry that as this younger generation of woke activists, as they start to entrench themselves and push away the more standard fare liberals, the older liberals who they don't like and are behind the times, that woke ideas, even though they represent a very small percentage of the overall American population, they're going to be overrepresented in cultural institutions, in film and art and music, whatever it might be. And I can understand why Republicans would be worried that at least now there's a sort of division of a kind of balance of power where the left has culture, arts, and mainstream journalism, and then the right has the presidency. If Biden wins, Democrats are going to have, or left of center, let's say, are going to have both political and cultural power, right? So I think it's our job as folks on the left to say, this is not an existential threat to who you are. We understand why you're concerned. It is sometimes scary to think about this cultural dominance and how there isn't room for, say, religiously or socially conservative ideas. So for example, I support gay marriage, but I have a lot of friends, Muslim and Christian, who don't support gay marriage because they're more socially or religiously conservative. They shouldn't be assumed to be bigots in this new cultural context just because they're trying to hold to what they consider to be their religious convictions. And we shouldn't say that, hey, you're a bad person, and always driving these ideas through so like if you're watching movies today or TV series on Netflix or Amazon Prime or whatever, anyone who isn't 100% down with gay marriage is generally depicted as like a Neanderthal, right? If you're seeing that day in and day out, that's going to have an effect on you, and you're going to feel threatened because people are essentially saying that your religious convictions are not appropriate in mainstream society. And so and I'm very much in the minority in this, but I feel like I want to convince more of my friends and colleagues and peers on the left in the Democratic Party to be less hostile to traditional manifestations of religion. We don't have to like it. We don't have to agree with it. And we should say, yeah, we support gay marriage, but we shouldn't demonize people who disagree. And there should be room for people who are more socially conservative in the Democratic Party. There shouldn't be a litmus test that if you agree with Democrats on every other issue, but you happen to be pro-life, or you happen to have a different view on gay marriage, or even on religious freedom issues more generally, that shouldn't mean that you're pushed out of the party.
Yeah, no, it's so interesting and weird, right? Like we have tolerance for if a religious tradition involves peyote, that maybe we can make an exception for that.
Yeah.
But if you want to adhere to, very strict, Christian or Muslim, doctrine, then that is intolerant. But what about the tolerance for the diversity of people who have rights of conscience and religious convictions, right? That's out the window.
Exactly.
And I do think people feel under siege, under attack. I mean, even Andrew Sullivan, right? Who I think Andrew Sullivan did as much to advance the cause of gay marriage as anybody in America, maybe in the world. And he was just attacked in the New York Times, and I saw other people, not in the New York Times, but other people calling him a fascist. That tells you where we are. The number one podcast I'm seeing promoted on iTunes is called Nice White Parents. Not sure exactly what that's about, but I don't think it's good.
Yeah, probably not.
So you understand if people feel a little bit under siege and under attack. And I think that, again, this becomes like a vicious cycle, right? So like the crazier and the worse Donald Trump is, then the more the mainstream media feels like they need to ratchet up their anti-Trumpism, both for like moral reasons and for business reasons. And then that gives people an excuse. Well, they're crazy. The left is, the left's too extreme. We got to go to Trump. And so basically, this will be a very controversial segue here, but I think I'm not comparing American domestic politics to terrorism. I will say that. But I think that, I think one of bin Laden's plans was basically to force people, especially Muslims to take a side, right? Like, we don't want you to think America may not be perfect, but it's still the land of opportunity. We want you to have to choose, to be forced to choose a side, a tribe. And I think that's kind of where American politics is. My dad was a prison guard for 30 years. In prison, it's super dangerous to not be part of a gang, because you don't have anybody watching your back, right?
Yeah.
And if you believe in individualism, and if you believe in pluralism, then I don't really like fraternities. I'm not a team player, you know what I mean? But like, we're kind of being forced to join a team right now.
Yeah, and this is why when you respond to fear with fear of your own version of fear, I mean, you create this endless cycle. And what we know is that when people feel existentially threatened, they adopt very bad political positions. They start dehumanizing their political opponents, and they might be good people. And I'm someone who always thinks it's important to distinguish between the sinner and the sin. Someone can have a very bad political opinion, maybe even a dangerous one, but is still someone who we should treat as a human person with full dignity. And they're not irredeemable. I think almost very few people are irredeemable. So this is what we're promoting. It's a zero-sum approach to politics. And if everything is a binary, then people are going to be pushed to a side they might not otherwise pick. And we know this. And as you mentioned, there's some parallels in the Middle East. And certainly as someone who's done a lot of field work and has lived in the Middle East, and focused on political conflict in some of those countries, I draw on that experience when I look at the dangers of American politics today. That once you start getting in this existential mode, which happened, for example, during the Arab Spring in Egypt, which was a country I was focusing on a lot during that period, and you saw the breakdown of society and you saw the eruption of political violence because you had different sides in the country, largely over, the role of religion in public life. And they couldn't resolve those fundamental differences peacefully. And everyone was dehumanizing the other. Opponents weren't just opponents, they were enemies to be destroyed. So when I hear the rhetoric that people are using today in the US, I actually am reminded of my experiences in the Middle East. And I never thought that would happen. I never thought that these concepts would be applicable in my own country here in the US. And that to me is very scary. And I think it's also interesting to note that if you look at the Harper's letter, if you look at some of the most vocal opponents of wokeness, a disproportionate number of them are actually Muslim or of Muslim background or Arab background. I don't think that that's a mistake because we know what this looks like. We know what political sectarianism looks like. It's not good, and there's no way out. Once you go down that route, it's really hard. It's really hard to kind of get back. And this is also why I feel like when people use words like fascist or Trump is a dictator, yeah, does Trump have authoritarian tendencies? Would he maybe want to be a dictator in his imaginary world? Yeah, probably. But when we start using language about US politics that is not accurate, it's hyperbolic, and it's not true factually. America is not on the verge of becoming a dictatorship. But if we use that language, we raise the stakes and we promote fear, and people start to look at politics in those terms. And I don't think we should be doing that.
Yeah, I do feel like we don't need to go down this rabbit hole. I do feel like Trump, unfortunately, stokes or eggs on this idea when he talks about 12 more years and things like that. But I found point well taken, and I think it's super interesting what you said about a disproportionate number of the people speaking out on this are from Muslim backgrounds. Hey, I wanted to ask you because you've been writing about how maybe this will be a good sort of conversation for us to end on about how people can like hate each other peacefully, This seems like maybe the best we could aspire to. How can, not you and me, but I mean, as a country right now, how can we do that? How can we hate each other peacefully?
Yeah, yeah. So that's something I believe in pretty strongly. I think it's difficult to do, but I think it is possible. So couple of the principles here is that first of all, we postpone ultimate judgment until the next life. That anything that deals with the temporal world, and here this draws on different religious ideas. I mean, there's a big strand in Christianity, even though I'm not Christian myself, but that I've been influenced by ideas around Christian pluralism, the Dutch theologian Abraham Kuyper, this idea that there's an inherent brokenness to this world and sin is part of our experience and that perfection is not possible until the return of Christ, so on and so forth. And what that means is that there has to be an epistemological or intellectual humility just about final judgments in this world, that we have to accept some level of imperfection, of indeterminacy, and that's just the reality of life in this world. But you can apply that more broadly in a secular sense, that political disagreements should not, as I mentioned earlier, they shouldn't be treated as if they're theological disagreements. And I do believe that God is the only ultimate judge. So when I think about some committee on anti-racism deciding who's a good person and who's not, I see that essentially as making moral judgments about people and in effect trying to play this godlike role of deciding what are, to me, ultimate questions that have ultimate answers that are beyond us. So humility is one, and you have to model this in your own life. It's very hard to kind of come up with policy prescriptions. And that's why I try to sort of, so to speak, spread the gospel, like on a personal level, that it's a different way of talking about and doing politics. So the way you apply this in practice is you say 98% of Americans, give or take, are not beyond the pale. And that you start to model that and you say, okay, I see this Republican person or even a Trump supporter, like in your family or a friend. As long as you can see that they're not, if they're willing to engage in good faith, if they're willing to actually have a conversation with you and you exchange ideas, the goal shouldn't be to persuade them that they're bad or persuade them to give up on Trump. It's to exchange ideas in the spirit of this intellectual humility. And it's up to them ultimately to make their own decisions, but they are not bad Americans. They are not evil. And I think that if you start adopting that approach, it changes how you engage on Twitter, for example. So one thing that I take very seriously is this idea that no one should be condemned in ad hominem terms. So even people who I really don't like, I try to be careful about how I describe them or how I engage with them. And I try not to take the bait. I try not to get in this mudslinging match because they might be going through personal issues. And actually, on Jesse Singal's podcast, they had Freddie DeBoer, who I think has been really vocal about this, that Twitter and social media in general brings out the worst in us, but not just the worst in us. Some people actually suffer from mental illness. And this is not to disparage. I mean, Freddie DeBoer himself draws on his own experience as someone who, I think it's bipolar disorder. And, so, you have to also have an allowance that people are going through their own shit, so to speak.
Yeah.
And we don't know. And that should give us a certain kind of, most people aren't evil, but there is this kind of social media aspect which magnifies these problematic aspects in our own psyche. Even people who are just like the most well-adjusted people ever, you see how Twitter distorts them, right? So I think just being aware of this broader context and trying to think more creatively or more seriously, let's say, about how do we do debate in a better way. And some of that might mean like the rise of podcasts and Substacks, where people want to have a smaller audience that is more dedicated and is more willing to engage in good faith back and forth. And then instead of doing that on Twitter, you do it on your Substack. That's what people are trying out now. But everyone
Yeah.
has to make their own personal decisions about how they do that in a better way. But I think you have to convince people first that there is a better way to have debates with your fellow Americans, and the alternative is scary. So you got to say, well, hey, you might feel like that some Trump supporters are a threat to your existential being, but they're not going to disappear. They're 40% of the country, and there is no other option but finding a way to live with them. So even if the revolution succeeds or whatever people think the left-wing revolution is, there's still going to be that 40% that is not down with the revolution. So what do? We live in a democracy, so presumably you're not going to imprison all of them. You're not going to have some
Well, there are guillotines being
yeah,
rolled out at these marches. So, I mean,
right. So I
you
think we should
never
push
know.
people and we should ask them, like, when you make jokes about guillotines. I actually had a friend the other day when I actually posed this question to her. She's a good friend. We're not on the same page on this woke stuff. She's kind of woke herself. And I'm like, hey, what do you want to do about the Trump supporters after the revolution? And she literally made a joke about guillotines. She wasn't serious, but that's also kind of concerning that we're joking about that. And I pushed her. I'm like, seriously, okay, jokes aside, tell me what you actually think should happen. She didn't really have an answer. And I think we have to push people on this question that what do you do with your fellow Americans? We're a democracy. Presumably, we can't constitutionally imprison people we disagree with. Now, if they say, well, actually, we think that some of these people should be imprisoned because of their political beliefs, then we know that we've reached an edge and there's not going to be productive debate or discourse. But I think it's helpful to actually push people. So I was fine with NPR publishing the In Defense of Looting author, that interview that everyone's been talking about on Twitter. Why? Because I think that's a view that a growing number of Americans in elite situations have. Even some of them are mainstream journalists. We've had, at least at least one prominent New York Times journalist who, early on when the protest was talking about how not all kinds of violence are actually violence and property damage is not
Right.
violence, all that kind of discourse.
Property damage is not violence, but silence is violence.
Yeah, but silence is violence.
It's amazing.
So if that's, I would rather hear that view expressed unapologetically so we as the audience can say, hey, this is what these people actually think. Let's be clear. So I'm also a big believer that if we have profound disagreements as Americans about political and ideological issues, we shouldn't be coy about our commitments. Because if we're dancing around these issues and not being explicit, we don't know exactly what we're debating. Let's be clear about our starting premises. Let's be clear about what we actually believe in this very contested moment. So when people talk about, you say you want a revolution, what do you mean by
Yeah.
revolution?
And by the way, if you just listen to the lyrics of the song,
Yeah.
I agree with the Beatles.
You got that reference. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. If you want money for people with minds that hate, I mean,
Yeah.
I don't have to go through the song. I agree with you, Shadi, but keep in mind the New York Times, they published an op-ed from a United States senator representing a view that I didn't agree with, but was not a fringe view about using federal troops to handle protests. And that guy got fired, right? The editor who okayed that op-ed. So I mean, I'll get accused of whataboutism for bringing this up, but it's okay to publish something in defense of looting, but not to publish what Tom Cotton wrote.
Yeah, and that's why I think people got to be consistent. So I try to be consistent to the extent possible. So my position was that I thought Tom Cotton's op-ed, like a lot of people, was really bad and frightening in its intensity and all that. I think that it represents, though, a significant part of the American population that would agree with sending federal troops. So I think that view should be debated and discussed. And and also once you make a decision to publish, I don't think it's healthy as a precedent to backtrack and say, oh, we shouldn't have published that. You made a decision, stick to it. And I also try to be consistent and say that if someone publishes something about in defense of looting, then okay, they shouldn't apologize for it. That's a view that's out there. Let's hear it. But the problem is most people aren't consistent. And you'll find a lot of people who are okay with in defense of looting being published, but we're not okay with Tom Cotton's op-ed being published. But let's call them out on that, but I think you're right. I think it sounds to me like you're pointing to what I think is a real problem is that there is a fundamental asymmetry at play where as an unwoke person myself, I'm not thinking to myself in the morning when I wake up, how do I get woke people to be fired? You never hear unwoke people calling for that. What we want is for unwoke people and woke people to coexist in mainstream institutions. So the New York Times should have Nicole Hannah-Jones. I don't want Nicole Hannah-Jones, the lead author of the 1619 Project, to be fired. She represents an important voice, even though I disagree with it a lot of the time. But then I don't think that she should be waking up in the morning and wanting Barry Weiss to be fired. So this is where I think so sometimes people will say, Shadi, what you're calling for is nice in theory, but then what happens when they're willing to fight you and they're willing to push you out and you're calling for coexistence? It means you're going to be destroyed, So I take that, I understand that viewpoint, but what's the other option? If we come up with a similar approach and we say woke people should be fired and we should fight them in our institutions and they're evil and bad, then there's no end to this. I don't want a permanent civil war on the left. Someone's got to stop and someone's got to model a different way of discourse, even if our opponents or adversaries don't uphold the same commitments.
Amen. As Axl Rose famously sang, I don't need your civil war.
Great song.
I couldn't agree with you, and I couldn't agree with you more. Let's plug some stuff, man. Talk about the Wisdom of Crowds podcast. How'd you get into this?
Yeah, sure. So we've been doing the Wisdom of Crowds for about a year, but we only started really ramping it up and getting more serious about it around when COVID started and the protests, and we felt this was the right moment to really do more of this, to have a kind of alternative space. So a lot of what we try to do is me and my co-host Damir Marushik of the American Interest, we try to basically model this kind of discourse. So we're not trying to pursue, he's more on the right, I'm more on the left. We don't necessarily try to convince the other that the other is wrong. And when we have guests, we're not trying to do that either. But we try to say, hey, why do we believe the things that we believe in? We try to interrogate our premises and really get into some of these deeper questions. And we have a lot of fun doing it. And he's one of my best friends. So there's also this sense of just being in a living room and talking in a very unfiltered, raw, even sometimes rambling way about culture, religion, identity, and all that. So we've really enjoyed it, and we've I think built up a bit of a cult following so far. And now we also started a Wisdom of Crowds newsletter. So we're trying to sort of do something similar there, where we have where Damir and I have these debates in written form, where we go back and forth on a particular topic every other week or so. And we're really excited about that, and I should say, just to kind of hype it up a little bit, we are we're redesigning the website, and we're going to have one exciting site called Wisdom of Crowds that has the podcast and the newsletter, has guest contributors, almost like a mini media thing that we're doing, where we bring a lot of these ideas together. So stay tuned for that too.
No, I love it. I think this medium is conducive to thoughtful, nuanced discussions. I think media have inherent skews, and I think the podcast and the newsletter may be the only positive technological developments that pertain to media in recent years, but very, very, very good. That's why I do it here. That's why I urge you, everybody, to support this podcast and support Wisdom of Crowds. And so for now, right, the website up, or should they go to iTunes?
It's not up yet, but the podcast is available on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, you name it. So I would encourage people to subscribe and take a look at what we're doing, and to follow me on Twitter to kind of see the latest as we kind of develop the Wisdom of Crowds. Also, the handle for Wisdom of Crowds is Wisdom of Crowds Pod. So yeah.
And it's a good name because there is wisdom in crowds. And I can tell you, starting our Patreon community here has been amazing. And every week, Bill Scher and I, Bill Scher is a liberal writer for Politico magazine. And every week he and I do a Zoom conversation where we have a civil debate about politics. And then we have conversations with everybody who's joining us, all of our supporters. And I have to tell you, that community, that conversation is so rewarding. And there is wisdom in that crowd. So everybody check out that podcast. Follow him on Twitter. It's at Shadi Hameed. I'll link to all that in the show notes. What a great conversation. Shadi Hameed, thank you for coming back on the news.
My pleasure, Matt. Thanks for having me.
If you like this podcast, rate and review it on iTunes. Follow Matt on Twitter at Matt K. Lewis. Thank you for listening to Matt Lewis and the News.